Welcome to the Smooth Brain Society. Today, Olivia is not with me. We have a new guest co-host in the form of our podcast producer, actually. So Alex is here to join us.
Hello.
Do you want to give us a quick intro about yourself more than just being our producer?
Yeah, so I'm a podcaster here at Salient as well, but I've been lucky enough to take over the role of producer for lots of the shows. I have just finished a undergraduate degree in media and film, and my experience in the field of psychology is very limited. I did 2 years of a high school paper, basically, in psychology. But yeah, I'm very excited to learn more, and I think we've got a very exciting topic.
Thanks, Alex. Now, as you just mentioned, the topic is real exciting, and to talk about it, we have Dr. Carolyn Wilshire. She is a lecturer in the psychology department of Victoria University of Wellington. Just a little bit of a background: she did her bachelor studies in Monash University, and then ended up doing a PhD at the University of Cambridge, United Kingdom. She has over 1,000 citations for her research work, and her research draws on cognitive neuroscience, neuropsychology, health psychology, and theoretical psychopathology. Those are all big words, which hopefully
Yes.
Dr. Wilshire can break down. But essentially, her work examines cognitive processes and neural systems involved in language and other high-level functions. And I won't go into all that more. We'll let Carolyn herself describe and elaborate on these points in more detail. So welcome to the show, Carolyn.
Thanks, Sahir. I'm glad to be here.
So should we just start off with those big terms and your research interests? So could you take us through a little bit of what you do?
So I'll start by just being general. My research interest is in neuropsychology, which is looking at the relationship between how we behave, how we think, and the brain structures that support those processes. And I'm most interested in the sort of highest levels of sort of thinking and decision making. So how we formulate language, how we understand complex speech, but also more recently I've got into what we think of as the sort of more frontal kinds of abilities, the things that we need to make complex judgments in order to plan our lives successfully, in order to decide how to behave in situations where there might be some sort of social consequences to doing the wrong thing. And also the sort of at the very highest level, I've become interested in the brain structures that support our, if you like, our will to our initiative, if you like. So those structures that enable us to have the energy to get up from that chair when we're sitting in front of the TV and go and do something. And these kinds of skills can become impaired after brain damage. So that's what I'd like to talk to you about today.
Well, yeah, I think that's really interesting. I think the way that, specifically what you mentioned there at the end about sort of the I guess will is the way to say it, maybe, of getting up and doing activity. I'm interested in how that changes after an incident of damage or whatever. Yeah.
So it's actually a really common problem in all sorts of people who've had some kind of brain illness or injury, is that we will assess them in the clinic and they might look completely okay on sort of our cognitive tasks that we use in the clinic. And then we send them back home to their families, and the families say, look, there's something different about my beloved one or my family member. They just don't seem to have any get up and go anymore. And although they will do things when I direct them to do it, what happens if I leave the house and go to work, then I'll often find, my family member, whoever it is, sitting on the couch exactly in the position they were in before I left, without having, for example, got themselves any lunch or been to the bathroom. So this kind of apathy is common after a lot of different kinds of illness. It includes stroke. It's common after a stroke. It's common after a traumatic brain injury, for example, if you're in a car accident. And it's also common in some forms of dementia. So it's as if the brain damage has somehow affected the person's kind of initiative or will to do things. And we don't have very good ways of assessing this in the clinic. Oh, should I stop and let you say something? Ask me a question.
No. Carry on. I'm listening intently.
Okay.
Yeah.
So the research we're doing in my lab at the moment is looking at a couple of populations of people with neurological illness. And we've created a series of tasks that we hope will capture some of these higher level aspects of behavior that we see are affected in brain damage, but which we don't measure very well in conventional neuropsychological assessments. And so we've got little tasks. For example, there's one task that is like a card gambling task, and you play for money and you have to pick up the right card. So we're trying to, if you like, emulate some of the kinds of situations that you're in everyday life, which might involve actual emotion or reward, because it appears to be the case that there are particular parts of the brain that are engaged in those sorts of circumstances. So by trying to incorporate those kind of real life elements into our assessments, we can maybe better get a handle on what the real problems are going to be for this person when they get home into their home environment.
Oh, you're a bit vague about, like, you kept saying regions. Could you kind of elaborate on what regions they are in the brain?
Okay, so I'm interested in the prefrontal cortex, which is the frontal lobes, that area right at the front of the brain. And there are a number of different subregions, so it doesn't work as a whole unit. Within our frontal lobes, there are various different areas that specialize in different things. So, for example, there's an area right above your eye orbits that's very important for judgment and decision-making in situations where there might be a lot of rewards or losses to be made. So, for example, if you're gambling at the pokies, or if you're asking a girl out on a date, for example, there are areas that seem to be important for helping guide your decision-making towards a good outcome. And those areas don't seem to be important when we're doing more cold tasks like studying for a test. They're only important when we're in these kind of emotionally charged, sort of hot situations. There are other areas of the brain right in the medial, right between the hemispheres and the prefrontal cortex, which seem to be, if you like, a center of will. So they seem to be important for allowing us to initiate spontaneous new behaviors. And so we find people who have damaged those areas will often respond well on tests when we ask them questions, but they won't initiate any new activity unless someone asks them to do it. So in our research, we're looking at various different populations of neurological illness populations. So we're looking at people who've had a brain tumor that's been recently diagnosed. We're looking at some people who have various different kinds of strokes. And we're devising this set of assessments which are going to capture these kind of emotional and kind of volitional aspects of human behavior that are so poorly described in current assessments.
You mentioned about the family members of someone who's now, had, let's say, an injury or a tumor, noticing that change. Is there any? Do you have any knowledge of how the person living with maybe that injury feels about that, lack of initiative? Maybe is there any like reporting from them on their perspective?
Interesting question, Alex. And there is often variable awareness of the problem.
Right.
And in fact, with one of those conditions I just talked about, the one where the damage is just above the eye orbits, we often find people don't seem to be concerned about the losses in their lives. So there's cases on record who have basically had to quit their jobs, often move back with their parents perhaps, or into care. And they take a very kind of nonplussed view about it. They say, well, my life was really complicated and stressful before, and I feel like now, it's much easier, and yeah, I feel really great about things. So there's often a disconnect between what family members see, and they see, the loss and the tragedy, and what the people themselves see. So the very things we're talking about can affect the person's awareness of their problems. So too for these problems with lack of initiative. Often the person themselves doesn't see a problem. So I didn't feel the need to get up and do anything today. I was perfectly happy sitting in front of the cartoons that were on the TV. And they often are not aware of the extent of the loss. So these are problems that kind of affect the fundamental personality of your personality, the structure of who you are, if you like. Yeah.
So this is not something like a gradual change. It is more of a just immediate post or you can time point it kind of thing, that like after an injury?
It depends on the condition. So sometimes it could be an indicator. So if you see some behavioral changes or some personality changes in somebody you know, it could be an indicator that there is perhaps a tumor or some degenerative illness. It could be the early onset of something such as Alzheimer's or some other dementias that could be affected. So sometimes these are the first things that family members notice. So it's important for us to be able to better test them, better assess them, and better identify them, because the earlier we can get onto some of these problems, the better. So early detection is often a really good, particularly in dementia. The earlier that we can detect dementia through behavioural assessment, the more quickly, the more rapidly we can start to initiate treatment. So it's very important to be able to detect those changes early. And often those changes are of these very kind of qualitative aspects of the person's personality, if you like.
So you've mentioned behavioral assessments. So, and I guess we've talked a little bit about, simulating real life sort of conditions. Like what is the setting for these? Someone who doesn't know this, how do these assessments take place, and how do you effectively simulate things like money and transactions and those heightened emotions and stuff?
It's really quite difficult, and we don't do it very well. But what we have is computer setups where we have we try to make them look. We use gaming kind of interface to inspire our computer games so that it looks game-like. We'll often use kind of icons like playing cards to try and induce that sense of winning and losing. And we also kind of present prize. We have like in the old shooting galleries where you had a prize wall with teddy bears all over the wall. So we have a prize wall in some of these assessments where people can see the prizes they can win if they earn a certain number of points while playing the game. So we've tried to do everything we can to kind of induce that kind of hot emotional context, make it have stakes, high stakes to the participant.
Yeah, I'm interested in because from what I know, ethics is a really it's a very important thing. I wonder what is the process of like getting a participant into that situation and explaining how much do they know about what's being assessed and that sort of thing.
Well, it's a good question you asked there, Alex, because as I said before, sometimes the awareness of some of these sort of personality changes is not great. It's more the family members and carers that are noticing these things. We don't assess anybody in our tests that doesn't have the ability to consent. So we're talking about people who can give informed consent. Although you're right that their awareness of some of their problems might be limited, in fact, but they're aware, at least to the extent of what we're looking for in our tests and what they're going to do in the tests.
Right.
It is, of course, very important to be able to explain to the participant exactly what we're trying to do and why, so that they fully understand what they're consenting to. Most of our participants can do that. And I think one thing I've learned with working with people who have brain damage is that they're extraordinarily intelligent, so you may have limitations in particular aspects of your cognition, but a person's core intelligence is not affected. They're still able to respond. They're able to understand. They're able to evaluate, even though they may have these very specific deficits in specific circumstances. You're always dealing with an intelligent person who's often demonstrating intelligent ways of getting around their limitations.
Yeah, that was going to be my next question. Well, for people with such brain damage, they do tend to still go on with their lives in most cases. So how do they circumvent certain shortages in brain injury?
So it depends on the function. So some functions that you see quite a lot of resolution just spontaneously. So after a few months after the incident, you might see some recovery. Other functions are more resistant to recovery, and a lot of it depends on the area of the brain that's involved and how plastic that area is, how much that the functions of that area can be taken up by other parts of the brain that are still healthy. So yeah, it does vary. I fucked it up again. But, and what was I saying? Let me just think for a minute. All right. Okay. So by learning more about the kinds of problems that can occur after brain damage, we can better design neurorehabilitation strategies that can help the person accommodate and perhaps regain some of the function that's lost.
What are some strategies that exist now before we even know that information? Like what are the sort of things that are already being deployed in these situations?
Right. So one of the problems really is money and funding.
Sure.
But where it's possible, where it's funded, some neurorehabilitation strategies use simple repetition tasks where you build on one very small task and then extend on it. So kind of scaffold the person to develop new strategies. A lot of the rehab techniques for cognitive problems at the moment are more on the kind of alternative strategy kind of route. So how else might you achieve this goal, or how? Let's think of ways we could help change the way you do this so that it won't affect the function you have. So, for example, in the in the speech area, which is one of my interests, one of the techniques we use is often family training, where we train the partners and the family members of the person to ask the right questions, to be able to probe the person who can't speak very well, and therefore better understand what they're trying to say. So often it's not so much actually changing or improving the function. Sometimes that's not possible. Sometimes it's about finding ways around it, finding new ways to deal with the problem, both from the perspective of the person and from those that are around them.
For all the things you've spoken about so far, let's move away from the actual a specific case of brain damage and so on to something a bit more common. So, for example, mental health issues like depression. How does what you do relate to something like that?
Well, I'm glad you asked that, Sahir. So there, obviously, some of the things I've talked about look a little bit like what we see in quite severe depression. So people who are severely depressed will have difficulty initiating activities. They'll have trouble getting out of bed. There's a sort of this crushing feeling they have that that prevents them from doing the things they want to do. And so by learning more about the brain structures that support those kinds of behaviors, being able to initiate behavior, we can learn more about what might be going wrong in depression. And there's now quite a large literature looking at the brain networks that are impaired or affected in major depression. So, for example, some of the areas that I'm interested in my research seem to be implicated in depression. So studies using fMRI, for example, neuroimaging studies have shown that those areas are not communicating very well with other parts of the brain network. There's a sort of reduction in what we call functional connectivity in those areas in severe depression. So there seem to be some features of severe depression in particular, which quite closely resemble what we see in actual organic brain damage. So the more we can understand about the neural basis of depression, also the better that we can treat it, and also perhaps better diagnose it. So as many of you will know, depression is a very big thing.
Mm.
You probably all know somebody who's been depressed. And that can vary from, feeling a little bit sad because you've broken up with your partner to, something that's like this all-encompassing kind of crushing feeling that makes you feel numb and immobilizes you completely. So depression covers a huge spectrum of things, and we need better ways to tease apart that great big conglomerate that is depression. So by understanding more about the neural basis of depression, some of the neural markers of depression, we might be able to start teasing apart different kinds. It may be possible that there isn't one depression, but in fact there's a number of different conditions that look quite similar that share a lot of features. So by better understanding the neural underpinnings of these problems, we can perhaps better tease them apart too and define them a little better.
So what you're basically saying is that in order to understand how it manifests in behavior, it's important to look at the areas and the regions of the brain or the subregions of the brain that are being most affected by the depression or the depressive condition or whatever.
Yeah.
Okay.
Alex, I guess what I'm saying is that it's another source of information. It's another avenue approach to the problem that might give us new insights.
Mhm.
So, up to recently, we've been able to study depression largely by either using animal models or by actually looking at the qualitative aspects of the actual depression, interviewing people, asking them to complete surveys of assessments. So this provides another source of information. It's not necessarily a better source, but it's one that we might be able to capitalize on to start teasing apart some of that, great complicated mess that we see in some of these diagnostic categories. They're very large and probably very heterogeneous.
Is there any research so far in this area which you know about? Because I feel, considering depression research has gone on a lot in animal models through surveys and all that. And you said we need to start teasing apart. Is there any basis to go on to begin with?
Oh, yeah. There's a massive amount of research that's been done on various common conditions such as depression and anxiety that has looked at, for example, some of the work uses resting state functional MRI, which is when you go into an fMRI scanner, in a scanner, and you just lie there and they give you headphones. They put the headphones on. They often blindfold you so that you're just lying there and resting. And then they can look at the activity in your brain. And one of the things that might be kind of giving us some good insights is what they call resting state functional connectivity, which is looking at how different areas of your brain interact with one another during the fMRI session. So you're just lying there with your headphones on and your goggles on, and you're just told to kind of think whatever thoughts you want. And the scanner looks at how the activity in different areas of your brain changes over time, and it looks at how those changes correlate between different parts of the brain, so we can look at those areas that appear to be talking to each other. So those areas where there's crosstalk. And this kind of method of looking at crosstalk between different parts of the brain has identified some really strong features in certain kinds of psychological conditions such as severe major depressive disorder and also anxiety. We see changes in the crosstalk, which may be diagnostic of what's going wrong. It does not mean that the brain is the cause of the problem. So everything that any behavior that you display will also be evident in your brain. It does not necessarily mean that the brain is at the cause of it. But it provides us with another source of information that's different from just observing how people are or how people say they feel, which might provide some more insight into the exact nature of the problem.
And once that sort of has been teased apart and we've got that basis of information, what would be your hopes to see on the other side? How would you like to see this information used, apart from better treating the conditions? I mean, are there specific ways you'd like to see that implemented?
In terms of the neuropsych, I'd like to see better characterization of some of the higher personality type problems that occur after brain damage. I'd like to see that information or the assessments that we design used in the early detection of certain kinds of illness. So, for example, although brain tumor is a relatively rare condition, it's often diagnosed extremely late. So the earlier that we can detect changes in these kinds of difficult to measure kind of abilities, the better we can identify things that need urgent treatment, such as tumors. Obviously, the earlier that your tumor is detected, the better your chances of being able to get treatment that's effective. And about 2/3 of people with tumors go on to recover after surgery. So there's a high recovery rate, and we could get that recovery rate higher if we could detect the early effects better.
Right.
And also other non-specific things that you and I are all familiar with that can be features of brain disease are things like feeling tired, fatigue, or feeling something's just not right, feeling your brain is kind of working through sludge. Some people who have serious illnesses such as brain tumors, they come to their GPs at the moment and they say, look, there's something is wrong. I know there is something wrong. I feel really, really tired. Every time I use my brain, I have a conversation, I need to lie down and close my eyes for an hour I feel there's something wrong. And what happens at the moment is a lot of those sorts of problems get psychologized. So the doctor will say, oh, look, tell me about your relationships. Tell me about your life. Are you finding work stressful? And of course, the answer to that is yes. Everybody's finding work stressful, and there's always something in your life that's going badly. I'm sure all of us here in this room could, if we were asked, we would come up with something really bad that is happening in our life right now. So there's a problem in that we often attribute things to psychological mechanisms, which are actually signaling something organic. So I'm keen to find better ways to detect genuine organic problems. And the consequences of that are bad too. So if you send somebody off who has a genuine serious illness and say, well, look, I think you should have a holiday, get some rest, make up with your partner, you're actually not solving the problem. But worse still, you're making them feel as if they are somehow responsible for the problem or have the power to change it. And that's not really fair, is it? If it's not that and they don't have the power to change it. So you say, look, I think you need therapy. Off you go to therapy, and the problem persists. The person feels they've failed in some way. They haven't engaged fully in the therapy, or somehow it's their fault. So it is really important for us to be able to tease apart psychological problems that are due to organic disorders such as neurological illness from ones that are genuinely amenable to therapy, that are genuinely due to the person's circumstances.
Yeah.
Well, do you think that in that scenario itself, being sent to therapy and this and that and feeling defeated, does that add to the problem in another way apart from just a tumor growing per se? Because I remember you mentioning once when someone said, oh, what's it? 3 months of mindfulness can change your brain. And you said, yeah, but 3 months of being in an isolated chamber can also change your brain. So therefore, yeah.
So here you're asking me about kind of the misuse of neuroscience now. Is that what you're asking? Sort of things like when you open the newspaper and it says things like, oh, new study has found that 3 weeks of mindfulness, I think it's 6 actually, 6 weeks of mindfulness can change your brain. Is that what you're talking about?
Yeah, good.
Yeah, so I think that there's always a need to be cautious about neuroscience research. And we do see a lot of headlines in the news that reference neuroscience research. So, for example, many of you would have heard that there's been some neuroimaging done on people who are considered to be psychopaths. So they score highly on scales of questionnaires that are designed to detect psychopathy, which is a lack of the inability to I shouldn't say scrap that. So people who seem to display a lack of empathy to others' distress. So they're able to feel distress and feel their own pain, but lack that ability to empathize when others are feeling pain. And in psychology, that construct is called psychopathy. And there's been some research looking at brain imaging in psychopaths, people that score high on a psychopathy scale. And it's found that they show various differences in the way they respond, for example, to pictures of other people in pain. So pictures of people who are wounded or who are suffering in some way. And so there was a lot of news about maybe 5-6 years ago. There was a lot of stuff in the media and popular press about how, it's been discovered that psychopaths have a brain abnormality. And that's true, but it's also not true. If you have any sort of unusual personality characteristic, then it's likely that will be evident in your brain when you're doing certain fMRI tasks. So just because you show a difference on fMRI does not mean the problem is caused by the brain. So we need to be careful not to confuse brain science with causation. It's not privileged in any way. Of course, anything that is unusual about you will be manifested in the way your brain activates, because that is that's what supports your behavior and causes it.
Yeah. I have a question related to that about the way in which how do I phrase this? I think, we talked a little, you mentioned about the way that the media might talk about certain activities and stuff, and you've spoken about the dangers of not being able to accurately diagnose organic or or, like actual conditions that are physically
Yeah.
manifesting because of things. Do you feel like in recent trends, I feel like there's a lot of attention on mental health in the media, in youth movements and stuff. A lot of people are talking about mental health. Do you feel like there's a danger of missing another issue here of like, if we're talking about things like mindfulness, things like connection and stuff, there are actual, physical issues that might be being left behind out of the conversation?
Yes, I do. So I think everybody in psychology has a position on this. So this idea of how much mental health problems are psychological, they're due to our thoughts and our situation, and how much they might be underpinned by biological problems. So I believe that both can be the cause of mental health problems, but I think sometimes we make the mistake of assuming that something has a psychological cause when in fact it has a biological one, and we need to better understand conditions that can mimic what we see in depression, conditions that might look a little bit like they're psychological but aren't. So, for example, some of my research, I've been looking at chronic fatigue syndrome. I don't know whether you know chronic fatigue syndrome, sometimes called ME. And has some similarities to long COVID. They're kind of overlapping conditions. And it's often assumed that the problems we see in these conditions have a psychological origin. So people have become nervous about taking on too much activity because they've been ill with COVID. So they become a bit obsessed with rest, and they rest, and that creates more fear. And each time they try and exert themselves, this causes them to have some symptoms. So then they revert back to resting. So one idea that's going on out there is that these kinds of conditions are actually caused by a kind of behavioral kind of negative cycle, if you like, behavioral thought cycle. And I don't believe that is the case. I believe that these problems are underpinned by physiological differences, and that we're missing these physiological abnormalities that can occur following severe viral illnesses, and that we're misconstruing the problem as psychological when really it needs medical treatment. So, yeah, I sit on that side of the equation that thinks that biological factors need to be considered. They're very important in mental health.
Yeah. So we mentioned the heterogeneity within depression, and just now you spoke about looking for treatments. How does this tie into future treatments of depression itself, and compared to how people tend to treat it now?
All right. So as you know, Sahir, depression, there's two treatments often offered for depression, which are often offered in combination. And one is drug treatment, pharmacological interventions such as SSRIs, and also psychotherapy, so often CBT, which is cognitive behavioral therapy. And the idea is these are often offered in conjunction with one another. The CBT is designed to reframe the person's thoughts away from negativity, so encouraging them to reframe some negative views they might have about themselves or their situation, or negative views about the future. And also instigate strategies that will help intervene against the sort of the behaviors that might exacerbate depression, such as self-isolation, so encouraging the person to use strategies to get out. So CBT is often oriented around those kinds of strategies, and it's often used in combination with pharmacological therapy such as SSRIs. And what would be a SSRI that people would know, Sahir?
Is this like an antidepressant?
Yeah, just antidepressant.
I think most people, from the layman's perspective, I guess if that's the right word, I think most people just call them antidepressants.
Oh, okay.
I don't know I don't know any specific terms personally. Yeah,
I was just thinking of like companies which sell them per se, but
yeah, I think we just kind of group them.
Not Prozac.
Yeah, Prozac's one, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so at the moment, there's a lot of depression that's not really relieved by either of these strategies, either in combination or alone. And It has to be said that in the research that's looking at, randomized controlled trials of drugs such as Prozac and other SSRIs, the effect sizes of these drugs are pretty small. That is, they're having a small and detectable effect, but not the kind of effect we'd like to see. It's likely that there are many people that are not successfully treated by these two strategies together. And we don't know why yet, but one of the problems is that we don't fully understand what depression actually is. And for example, if depression is a collection of slightly different problems that all look a little bit similar, if we were to group all those problems together and try to find a treatment for them, it's likely that it wouldn't work because the treatment would work for some subgroups and not others. And so when we averaged across everybody, we wouldn't get a very big effect size. So the more we can better characterize what depression actually is and what forms it takes, the more we can refine the description of these problems, the better that we can actually treat the problems. We'll be able to actually find more reliable evidence of effective treatments.
Mm.
So the challenge for psychology now is as much about defining the concepts as it is about we have this wonderful technology, and it's the same. We have this wonderful fMRI. We have these incredible statistical techniques for studying how different networks in the brain speak to one another. What we lack is really, really intelligent conceptual structures that will allow us to then, apply those. So we're looking for example, abnormalities in a group such as those with depression. We need to start thinking about what we mean by depression a little bit more carefully before we can actually use these techniques effectively. So.
I'm interested in a condition you mentioned before, chronic fatigue, because my understanding is that it's quite resistant to treatment. It can be something that lasts a very, very long time. And I guess it's the hope that once, there is a better understanding of the brain's actual physiology, the function of it, because I know you mentioned, your suspicions around the behavioral side as well, as being the sole cause. As the idea that then you'd be able to find those more acute treatments that can help relieve those symptoms.
Oh, that's exactly right, Alex.
Okay.
So if we're looking in the wrong place, we're never going to find the answer.
Right.
And you're right. So treatment interventions that sort of assume that chronic fatigue syndrome is psychological, they involve things like CBT, trying to reframe your thoughts that, you believe you're ill, but you're not really. They're extremely ineffective, and they can actually be quite harmful. You can imagine that if you genuinely have a physiological problem and you're being told that, you've got to start believing you don't, it's kind of psychologically harmful as well. Other treatments are actually physically harmful, so they might encourage people to slowly increment their activity. You've got to get back out there, do it bit by bit. That one's called graded exercise therapy. And sometimes it can cause people to have massive relapses. So in fact, that it's not just a perception that they're having symptoms after activity. It's a genuine problem. And you can make it worse by trying to encourage them to increment their activity. So, and of course, if we're only offering treatments that target a psychological kind of conceptualization of chronic fatigue syndrome, we're never going to find a treatment that works because in my opinion, we're looking in the wrong place. It's only until we start looking in the right place at the right kinds of, or the likely causes, that we're going to be actually be able to find treatments that work.
Interesting. Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense, I think. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense to me, at least. The idea that you can't treat something effectively without knowing it's
knowing what it is.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, I find it really interesting that, because from my perspective as an outsider, depression is something that is really widely talked about. And I find it really interesting that there is a lot of, it doesn't seem like there's a consensus about exactly either the causes or the effects, because it is such a broad condition. Because, I guess we've talked a little bit about the scale of studies that have been conducted. Do you feel like in the next few years, or, the foreseeable future, that it's going to, the number of studies is going to intensify as we notice more things like the perceived mental health crisis and stuff? Do you feel like there are going to be more studies that delve into the sort of things you're investigating yourself?
Yes, I think that there'll be an increased interest. So what's happening in the United States is there's a new research program that's beginning called the RDoc. I don't know if you've heard of the RDoc.
No, I haven't.
It's a program which is trying to take a slightly different approach to understanding psychological problems, which utilizes some of the new methods we have, such as functional neuroimaging, and tries to integrate that. So instead of identifying sets of syndromes or symptoms, which is what we do at the moment, the idea is to characterize the behaviors that normal people have and the different sort of mental processes they have, and look at what structures support them, what neural processes support different kinds of mental problems, and then extrapolate to people who are really suffering at the top end. Right, so have a science that's based on the whole population rather than just looking at those people who have already been diagnosed with a problem. I'm probably not explaining this very well.
No,
It makes sense completely.
So that's kind of the initiative, the RDoc initiative, which has been going for about 10 years in the US and has been influential around the world. There's something else you said there about how many people seem to be affected by depression. And you're right. And one of the problems is, of course, that the concept is very broad. And so you can use that label for a very large number of problems, which can range from, feeling low because you've had a breakup with your relationship to what major depression, what people describe, people with depression, really severe depression, they describe it as this kind of agonizing, gut-wrenching numbness that just consumes you, and sometimes it's like feeling nothing. And very different from the sort of day-to-day kind of downness we might feel in response to bad things in our lives. So I feel there's often a conflating of those two things. On the one hand, we have a set of problems which are distressing and need treatment, but on the other hand, we have a problem that is so all-consuming, and it's not something that you can treat with psychotherapy. It's not something people think themselves into, and therefore it's not something they can think themselves out of. There's something fundamental at the biological level that has changed in their bodies that needs fixing. So, I guess I fall on the biological causation side quite strongly, don't I? At least when it comes to that really severe major depressive disorder. Yeah.
Wow. That was very well put, the think yourself out of. Yeah.
Were there any other?
No, I'm just reflecting on that.
Yeah.
It was a very powerful statement, I thought. Very interesting. Yeah, and I don't know, I've never heard the biological sort of argument of the causes, I guess, and that's really interesting.
Yeah, you hear a little bit about the genetic stuff that certain people are more predisposed, and therefore if they're in certain conditions, then you see it. But you don't really hear much of the biological.
Yeah, still the dominant view in psychology, obviously CBT emphasizes the person's thoughts and cognitions and biases. So the idea is to try and intervene on those. The idea is when someone has depression, it means they've become focused on the negative. They're biased towards negative information in their environment. They're ignoring good news. They're noticing the people that don't like them at work. They're not noticing the people who appreciate them. So a lot of CBT is around sort of changing the cognitive attributions and biases of a person to try and intervene on the depression. And I'm not totally convinced that all forms of depression are amenable to that kind of thought rearrangement, that there's something profoundly biologically amiss in some very severe cases.
So can I then ask you, in the future, say we know more about these, we know more about what brain regions cause what things, how would treatments for these look like then? So how would you even change something if you figured out that, say, this brain region in the prefrontal cortex is more effective, or is not more effective, but is more prominent in a certain variety of depression we're seeing? How would we treat that?
Okay, so my view is that this is indirect information that helps us understand the condition. It's not a way to a treatment in its own right. It's not, because the brain information doesn't necessarily mean the brain is causing it. It just gives us another aspect of the picture. In fact, we are not just brains, we are bodies, right? Our emotions are expressed throughout our whole body. We have systems outside the brain that play a crucial role in certain kinds of mental illness. So the answer isn't necessarily to be found in the brain, and the brain isn't necessarily the cause of everything. sometimes we need to consider the whole biological organism as a whole as well. But by looking at the brain, we can use that information to better characterize some of the problems we see, and that might help us divide up the landscape of psychological problems into some more kind of refined categories that will allow us to tackle it at a different level.
Mm. Yeah, wow. I think obviously coming from a media background, the way that depression is talked about a lot is maybe it's definitely rudimentary, maybe, and simplified, and doesn't reveal the depth of the issue or issues maybe that are being faced by large populations or populations around the world, right? And it's really interesting that this research is obviously still going on to sort of figure out exactly what's happening. It feels like, do you feel like there's we've talked about this is the ideal maybe future where we have these categories. Do you feel like there's almost a race? Like if the problem is maybe getting worse or becoming more apparent, is there a race to figure out all these categories? I don't mean to put that pressure on you to start a race or anything.
I wish there was.
Oh, yeah?
I think a lot of the work is assuming that we know what we're talking about when we characterize depression, and it's looking at treatments. So that's what the majority of research is looking at now. It takes these categories as a given. And so I would actually like to start a race in better characterizing these different conditions, and maybe using some of these other tools such as neuroscience to help do that. Yeah.
I feel that would require quite a bit of investment as well from governing bodies and so on.
Yeah, it would. It's something else that Alex, you just made me think of when you were talking there, and that is what happens when we label things, like when we have labels for mental health conditions. So you say, oh, well, I'm feeling sad, and you go to the doctor and the doctor says, you're feeling sad because you have depression. And sometimes that can sort of lead us astray because we think that by labeling it, we've somehow explained it. But in fact, someone telling you have depression does not explain your problem in any way at all. It just redescribes the experiences that you're having and the problems that you're reporting. So at the moment, and I think perhaps it's great that we're using mental health terminology to talk about in everyday life, and that we're aware of mental health problems. And that's a really important step forward, I think, for us. But it's important to remember when we do use terms such as depression, it doesn't tell us anything really meaningful about what the problem is or how we might treat it. It's extremely loose. And we need to be very cautious about labeling and thinking, oh, well, that's depression, and somehow that explains it. It doesn't explain anything. It merely describes the situation in another terminology. So I don't know whether I'm going off now and getting too intellectual on you.
No, not at all. This is fascinating. I don't know. I think it's really, I don't know. Sahir, is there anything about that you wanted to talk about?
I wanted to expand this a bit further into maybe a ranty section for you a little bit, because I wanted to ask then, Alex is a media studies person. We've spoken about the current popular culture view on depression and so on. Are there any misconceptions which people think say about neuroscience or your field or things about the brain which you'd like to address? So things which aren't true, which people sometimes take as gospel.
If you had some examples, that would be good of things people believe. I guess that the thing that, while you're thinking of examples, the thing that comes to mind is that people think the brain science is somehow privileged or somehow insightful and better than other approaches. So I often see a kind of, you see this a lot in the media, in newspapers. Brain science gets quite a lot of airplay, and there's something I think quite seductive about brain science that makes us feel that it's really true and really accurate and really correct. And there's this sort of, I don't know, maybe it's the concreteness too of the idea of the brain. That's the thing. If we talk about thoughts and feelings, these are kind of, abstract concepts. We talk about, this part of the brain isn't functioning, or there's a problem with your brain. people like the appeal. So it's a double appeal, I think. There's an appeal about the sort of, it sounds very scientific, but there's also something quite concrete about thinking, oh, it's my brain that made me do it, or my brain is wrong. And I'd like to encourage people to think of themselves as not as brains, but as bodies, because we're embodied. And actually, a lot of the experience of emotion is happening throughout your body. It's not actually in your brain. So I'd like, whenever anybody says in conversation, oh, my brain made me do this, I'm like, no, you made yourself do that. Your brain is not you. You are an embodied creature that has a brain. So getting our emphasis off the brain, I guess. So it sounds sort of contradictory, doesn't it? I obviously am a neuroscientist and I'm interested in the brain. But on the other hand, I'm very skeptical about some of the beliefs and some of the ways that brain science is being interpreted out there.
Wow. Yeah, I'm trying to think of examples of misconceptions, but I think that's really interesting, the idea of being a neuroscientist who is skeptical. I think that is that maybe a healthy approach to maybe not take everything as granted, I
think it's very important.
Yeah.
And actually, here's a plug here I'll give you there's a website called neuroskeptic.com. And it's written by he's a genuine neuroscientist, and he'll he puts blog posts up there maybe once a fortnight, once a month, and he'll take some recent study or some recent media article and unpack it and talk about what the problems are with it. So, what claims are valid, what claims aren't. That's neuroskeptic.com. It's really fun if you're interested in neuroscience to go in and have a look at what Neuroskeptic is saying.
Yeah, that'll be one to check out.
Yeah, that would be cool. I just thought of random ones, like, for example, creativity is on the right side of your brain, or what was the other one? You only use 10% of your brain at a time, or things like those, which people mention. And
so there's the left brain, right brain thing that when my kids went through primary school about 20 years ago now, they were given brain training exercises which involved moving both sides of their body, moving their arms, moving their legs, in order to encourage interhemispheric communication between the right and the left hemisphere so that they would become more creative. I kid you not. My kids loved it because it was exercise. So no, there is no evidence whatsoever that any kind of motor activities will increase interhemispheric communication. And no, although the right hemisphere of the brain does have some specialties in things that we use for art, such as music and tone, such as spatial abilities, it is not the case that the right brain is more creative. Creativity requires integrated activity throughout our whole brain, and it requires our prefrontal cortex. But more importantly, rapid interconnections between front and back on both sides of the brain. So no, the right hemisphere is definitely not the creative part. But isn't that sort of part of the problem? So somehow we all latched on that, didn't we? This idea of right brain, because there's something about the brain. What you're talking about, is whether a person is creative or not. Somehow we've turned this into a right brain thing, somehow as if these two things are in opposition. Somehow if you're left brain, you're all kind of, what are you? Kind of a linear thinker and very, very structured. And if you're right brain, you're sort of creative. This is not the case at all. There's no lateralization to any of these styles of thought, and the idea is that they're also in opposition. That you're either one or the other is kind of crazy too. No, that you can be very linear and structured, and you can be very creative. And in fact, you need a combination of both those things to be creative, don't you? Depending on your domain, you need structure, you need discipline, and then you need to be able to impose creativity onto that structure as well. So it's actually the interplay between those two things that makes someone good in any sort of artistic field, that makes them creative. They not only obey the rules and understand the systems, but then they can use that information to then build and create.
Yeah, I totally held that misconception for a long time. I'm not afraid to admit that I was conned by the media. No.
By your people.
Yeah. My own discipline betrayed me there. It's all the TV shows. Yeah.
No, but thank you so much. What's the time?
It's 3:45. We've been recording for 57 minutes.
Do you
It's a
think
long
we?
podcast.
Yeah. Do you think we should wrap up?
Yeah,
No?
I think.
I think
I
people
feel
will
like
be
Awesome.
bored of the
Okay.
sound of my voice by now.
no,
Nah,
no.
definitely not. And we've covered so many things as well.
Yeah,
Then we started with just more abstract brain injury and things, and then tied it all into depression and tied it on into media perception. So we covered a lot.
yeah, lots of ground there. And I thought, I think that was really amazing. I felt very much like I understood everything that was going on, which is good.
That's great.
Yeah, no, it was very well explained.
All right. The last thing which we do is a few rapid fire questions. So we'll just rattle off questions and you answer them real quick. They don't have to do with they don't have anything to do with your research work per se, unless you want to bring that into play. So I've got the questions here. What I can do is I can put them in the middle of us.
Yeah, and then we can alternate maybe.
Yeah, exactly.
Cool. I'll start. Okay. Do you prefer summer or winter?
Summer.
Movies or TV shows?
Oh, TV shows, I think.
If your life was a movie or TV series, what genre would it belong to?
If my current life were a movie or TV series, I don't know, something noir. If it was my ideal life, I'd be in a spy thriller, I think.
Whoa.
Yeah.
Do you have an idea of who would play you, or?
It'd have to be Emma Thompson. She's 10 years older than me, but still, she'd be great.
Yeah.
Cats or dogs?
Dogs.
Which weighs heavier, a ton of feathers or a ton of steel?
Neither. This is a question from the Boston Aphasia examination.
What's your weapon of choice?
Oh, that would be a revolver.
Whoa. Definitely a spy. Which superpower would you want to have?
Invisibility.
What is your least favorite type of music?
Country and Western.
Ooh. What's your favorite cuisine or food?
Probably French.
What is the ugliest fruit or vegetable?
Jackfruit.
Yeah, that is an ugly fruit. I agree with you.
It makes a really good, fake pulled pork. I made that the other night.
Oh, really?
Yeah, it's delicious.
It smells. It smells real bad though, like the raw fruit itself.
You're right, but we use young jackfruit, and you pull it apart and you marinate it in chipotle and paprika, smoked paprika, cumin. You make this amazing taco filling.
Okay, so basically you cover up the taste of the jackfruit with as much stuff as you possibly can.
Very true.
It's supposed to absorb flavor pretty well.
It
so
does
I guess.
amazing. Yeah.
All right. If you could be any animal, what would it be?
Oh, that's tricky. And it's not great these days to be an animal, is it?
Mm.
No. I suppose I would be a giraffe in the wild.
What is the worst thing you've paid money for?
Tricky one. The worst thing I've paid money for. I'm completely stumped on that. Sorry.
No, that's good
stumped.
that nothing comes to mind, honestly.
You've done well then.
You pass.
You're a student, and one of our former guests, Josh Faulkner, said that water was the worst thing he's paid money for. He reckons it's such a scam.
It's not
That's
wrong.
really good that he came up with something,
Yeah.
unlike myself.
Anyway, what's something ridiculous someone has tricked you into believing?
Oh, shit. I can't think of anything.
My answer is the right brain, left brain thing, I guess.
Give me a minute. If you can cut this out, give me a minute. I'll see if I can think of something and make it more interesting.
To be fair, I did believe in the 10% thing for a little bit.
Yeah.
And then
There was a movie that really popularized it. The Lucy, I think, with Scarlett Johansson. What if you used 100% of your brain? She's time traveling and stuff.
Exactly. Yeah, that one.
Look, I just can't reflect enough on my own beliefs to do that one.
That's a soundbite.
This is at least you can think of things like that. I can't think of anything.
They did something else as well. What was the other movie? Split, where he starts accessing his brain and then starts leaping buildings and
because that's what's the it's a disorder. What's it called?
It was
multiple personality disorder. But then the idea that Yeah, he had one personality that gave him superpowers, and it's like, oh gosh.
All right, ask the question again because I think you've just given me my answer there, Alex.
What ridiculous thing has someone tricked you into believing?
Well, when I was a postgraduate student at Cambridge, I read a book about dissociative identity disorder and believed that it was a thing.
Whoa, interesting.
By the way, it's no longer believed that it's a thing, or at least the evidence of it as being as pronounced as it's been made out to be is very, very weak. And a lot of the cases that have been reported, the personalities have been evoked through hypnosis and often psychedelic drugs.
Wow.
So there's there's quite a weak evidence base for the existence of that. Which isn't to say that certain memories don't become more available to you when you're in certain emotional states. That's certainly true. We do have different sides of our memories that we access in different emotional states. But the idea that you have these, compartmentalized personalities is probably not true.
Interesting. If you could live anywhere in the world, where would it be?
Anywhere in the world. Ooh, good one. Somewhere warm. I might be heading up to Queensland, I think.
Oh yeah.
Yeah.
That'd be nice. That's definitely warm.
Yeah, much warmer than here.
Yeah, I'm doing shit on these.
Ask you. If you were not doing this, what would you be doing?
What would I be doing right now?
Well, you can take it as now.
Not doing this as a job.
Yeah,
wasn't working here at Vic. Really good question. I'd be working with dogs.
Oh,
yeah.
That's nice.
Yeah, I'd be working in dog rescue. That would be my alternate career path was going to be guide dog trainer. Thought, what an awesome job that would be. So I'd be working with dogs in some capacity.
Where did it all go wrong and you ended
up here?
I
ended up here.
And lastly, if you could give us one piece of advice to leave with, what would it be?
Be skeptical.
Oh.
And don't believe that we've all got it worked out because we so haven't.
Ooh.
That's my last soundbite.
Nice.
Yeah, that's great. Thank you so much. Thanks again, Alex, for joining.
Thank you for having me.
Looking forward to having you on more as well. Thank you again, Carolyn.
Welcome.
And thanks everyone for listening. And until next time, keep being skeptical.
Yep, keep being skeptical.
All right, thanks.
Amazing.